Hello, hello, everyone. Good morning, and thank you for being here. We are just now a minute after 10 o'clock, so we might have a few more people join us, but we're probably at about the number of attendees that we're going to be seeing this morning. But as we give a few more moments for more folks to join, I want to just test out the audio and the chat box. So if you look to what should be at the right of your screen, there should be a chat box there. So if everyone could please just test that out for me. You should see a message from me there that just says, hey everyone. If you can just type in the chat box a greeting. See, I've got a question coming in. I'm going to look at this real quick. Yeah, if you see the chat box there, go ahead and type in a greeting. Give us your job title if you'd like. Oh, great. Good morning, Diane and Gina and Jasmine and Sarah and Monique. Okay, Monique says unable to type in chat box, but your answers are coming to me through the question box, so that's perfectly okay. We can keep it at that. Hi, Laura, welcome. Hello, Danielle and Patricia. Good morning, everyone. I hope you're all doing great. And Katie, good morning. Awesome. We've got a pretty great crowd this morning. I'm really excited about this. Okay, good. Can everybody see my presentation on your screen as well? Let me get a few affirmatives that is up. Yes. Okay, wonderful. Thank you all. Great, we're good to go then. All right, thank you all again for joining. Our topic this morning is trauma-informed care practices for sexual assault advocates, and I'm really excited to get to talk about this with you all this morning. You can continue using that question box as we go through. If you have any questions, I don't have any other facilitator with me here this morning to monitor that question box. So it may take me a moment to get to those, or we might wait until the end for me to address some things, but I will try to keep an eye on that as we go, just in case anybody has an urgent question, something that we need to get to before moving on. But I do hope to have some interaction from all of you this morning as well. So I'm really glad that question box is working for everyone. We'll keep utilizing that going forward. All right, so I'll go ahead and introduce myself now. My name is Megan Batista, and I'm the newly appointed training coordinator here at the Tennessee Coalition to End Domestic and Sexual Violence. I've been here for over 4 years, and for most of those 4 years, I have coordinated the Coalition's Rural Sexual Assault Project. But like I said, I've just recently moved into this new position as training coordinator. I'm really excited about that. I am still working on the rural project to some extent right now, and it's because of the rural project, as you see from that disclaimer at the bottom of the screen, that I'm able to bring this presentation to you today. So big thank you to the Office on Violence Against Women for this opportunity. If you have any technical questions related to something like registration for this training or any other at the Coalition, and you have questions about obtaining a certificate, those will not be sent out automatically for this particular training, but if you would like a certificate, you can absolutely email me and I would be happy to issue you one. If you have questions about completing the post-training survey or accessing the recording that will be posted to YouTube, then please, email me, let me know, and I can take care of any of those needs for you. On that note, I'd like to invite you to please complete the post-training survey that you will receive after this session is completed. I would love to receive your feedback and your questions, so please do take just a moment when you receive that survey, fill it out for me, and let me know what you think. One last housekeeping item. Some of what we covered today might feel triggering, and I just want to say it's okay if you need to take a break and step away from your computer. Please do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself. That's priority. All right, we're going to dive right in. Start with our learning objectives. So these are the objectives we're focused on this morning. In this 1 hour live webinar, we're going to discuss sexual violence related trauma, discuss how trauma impacts a survivor's psychological, physical, and emotional well-being, and identify some common trauma responses. We're going to explore how an understanding of trauma can really change the way that sexual assault advocates work with survivors, and explore what it means for sexual assault advocates to provide truly trauma-informed care. So what is trauma? Generally speaking, trauma is something that occurs that is distressing, it's threatening, or disturbing, that has an impact on a person's mental, physical, emotional, or spiritual well-being. I would love to get some examples of trauma in the question box. So type in the question box. Just give me a few quick examples of what a trauma could be. Sexual abuse, absolutely. Thank you, Sarah. Gaslighting at home, definitely. Participating in war, physical abuse, teen dating violence, stalking, yes. All of these are trauma. And traumas can be things like car accidents too, right? Yeah. Okay, wonderful, really good examples. Witnessing a crime, yes. Getting bullied at school, absolutely, thank you. So notice from these examples that we have and from this definition that it's a little bit vague, right? It really only tells us that traumatic events occur on a pretty wide spectrum. And that doesn't tell us what we need to know about helping people who have experienced trauma. So the more important question we want to ask is, how does trauma affect the brain and the body? It's not nearly enough to understand what trauma is. We have to understand what is happening in the brain and throughout the body when a person experiences trauma. So we're going to get a little bit technical here and talk about some neuroscience. The first piece to understanding trauma is to understand how the brain is laid out and operates. So right here at the base, we have the reptilian brain. And it's called the reptilian brain or the reptile brain because it's comprised of the main structures that you find in a reptile's brain. It is instinctual. It's the part of the brain that controls all the instinctual things that we don't have to think about that allow us to live. So things like our heart rate, our breathing, our balance, our ability to digest our food, all of that stuff that keeps you alive without you even trying, the reptile brain is responsible for that. And it's very, very reliable because it's instinctual. It keeps working through almost any circumstance, even say, for example, when you're unconscious. Now, on top of the reptile brain, we have the limbic system. And this is going to be our greatest focus this morning. We're going to keep coming back to the limbic system. So the limbic system is what makes you a mammal. It's what we have in common with all other mammals. Like the reptilian brain, it is also instinctual, but it contains the structures in the brain that are also responsible for forming memories and for creating and processing emotions. So the limbic brain is the part of the brain that lets you focus on some things while ignoring others. It's the part of the brain that's responsible for making first impressions and for evaluating how trustworthy someone is. The limbic system is responsible for all the physical responses that we have to things that we enjoy or that we hate. When you pet a dog, it will instinctually wag its tail, right? And this is the dog's limbic brain at work. It's having a physical response to that emotional experience. The body is processing something that feels good. A common example for humans is dancing, right? We hear music and our body feels good and we want to move instinctually, right? That's the limbic system at work. And then at the top of this like three-part pyramid of the brain, if you will, we have the neocortex. And the neocortex is the part of your brain that makes you a human. It is self-aware. It can think super meta thoughts. It's responsible for things like language and sensory perception and solving problems. It's also responsible for your motor skills and your multitasking abilities. All of these things utilize your neocortex. And the neocortex, unlike the limbic brain and the reptile brain, is conscious. It's not based on instinct. And this is important because this means that it is slower than the other two parts of the brain. So if the neocortex and the reptile brain send out signals at the same time for the body to do something, the reptile brain is the one that's going to win the race. That instinct kicks in faster. So that's the foundation. Now let's talk about the part of the brain that trauma occurs in. Any guesses about which of the three that we just covered it is? Where does trauma take place in the brain? The limbic system, exactly. Yes, thank you, Sarah and Laura. So one of the main structures in the limbic system is the hippocampus. And almost all the time, the hippocampus is responsible for forming memories and filing them away for later use. And that's happening all the time for us. We have the hippocampus to thank for remembering things like the name of our kindergarten teacher or our cousin's birthday or those emails we sent just a few moments ago. All those memories were formed and stored by the tiny hippocampus within the limbic system. And then touching the hippocampus is an even tinier part of the limbic system, and that's called the amygdala. And it has one job and one job only, and that's to sense danger. Now, of course, I can't see all of you right now, but if I could, I bet that I would have been able to see some of your amygdalas hard at work when I switched to this slide. This red color on the screen is surprising, right? It's a little startling. It may have acted as a signal to your amygdala that there could be a threat. And notice how instinctual that is, how quickly you can have a reaction. But then, of course, our neocortex catches up, and I'm sure you realized, like, oh, wait, I'm obviously not in any danger here. This slide across my computer screen or the color red, it cannot hurt me. But that instinct is one of our survival responses. And we've all heard of these three survival responses. We have fight, flight, and freeze. These are all possible survival responses, all normal, instinctual responses that we have little to no control over. And there are a few things that are going on in the body when these survival responses kick in for us. One is that the hippocampus, which is responsible for memory, right? Forming memories just stops. The hippocampus stops recording altogether, possibly, or the recording becomes extremely jumbled. So much so that the playback is like watching an old VHS tape that's broken. That's why for so many survivors of trauma, and we see this so often with survivors of sexual violence, that the memories they do have attached to the event are disjointed, or very often they are nonlinear, or maybe there are whole blocks of time that are just completely blacked out. They have been totally erased from the memory, or the hippocampus never even filed them away as a memory. Or maybe those memories come back later in bits and pieces because the hippocampus is not forming or filing those long-term memories anymore in that moment of trauma. What it's doing instead is pumping cortisol and other hormones. And what's cool about filling the body with cortisol, which we often call the stress hormone, right? That temporarily stops us from feeling pain. So it's a natural survival mechanism that's kicking in for us. And I mean, we all probably have examples of this, right? A time that we were hurt, but we didn't realize it. That was our hippocampus at work. And then there are other hormones released at this time as well. Catecholamines are responsible for the adrenaline rush that you've probably felt when you're scared. They activate the emotional response in the amygdala of the brain. And they also have effects on our cognitive functions, like our ability to form memories, right? So that's what's happening with the hippocampus there. It's those catecholamines kicking in. And then natural opiates are kicking in as well, and those are responsible for a numbing effect. And that kicks in during trauma as our body's way to try and dull the pain for us. It's our brain's way of saying, like, nope, your body can't take this right now. Let me help you out with some natural pain management. That's the natural opiates kicking in. And then oxytocin is released to increase positive feelings, to try and counteract the very negative trauma that our body is experiencing. And when all four of these hormones are released and acting together, the body commonly initiates the freeze response, meaning some victims become literally paralyzed with fear. And this is known as a neurobiological condition called tonic immobility, or rape-induced paralysis. And the other thing that we know that starts happening is that the amygdala starts prepping the body for what might be coming next by sending extra blood flow to your muscles and increasing your heart rate and shutting down any of the body systems that are not essential to survival right now. So an example of this is if you've ever heard of someone throwing up because they were nervous or stressed out, that's a survival response from the amygdala. Or if you've ever known someone who peed in their pants because they got scared, that's the amygdala shutting down the lower digestive tract. It's the body's way of saying, I literally can't right now with the digestive system. I have more important things to focus on. And so, you know, when you hear people say something just came over me, like, I don't know, something just came over me, I don't know why I did what I did. That something is a survival response. That's the amygdala that they're talking about in that moment of trauma. And the thing about that is that you literally have no control over whether your body is going to fight, flight, or freeze. And remember, this part of your brain is instinctual. And from person to person, and even from situation to situation, every single survival response is going to be different. Okay, so let's complicate this just a little bit. What happens when a situation was so overwhelming within the limbic system that it stays in survival response and the rational brain or your neocortex has a really hard time taking back over? This is what is happening when a person has PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. The trauma is over, but their brain just can't revert back to non-emergency mode. And sometimes PTSD shows up right away. It's immediately apparent. Sometimes it appears even decades later after a trauma. And when a person has PTSD, they are re-experiencing their trauma through things like intrusive thoughts, possibly flashbacks, maybe nightmares. And these are usually set off by one of that survivor's triggers. Now, I'm sure probably most of you are familiar with the word trigger, right? They're also called trauma reminders. And not all triggers are related to PTSD, but a trigger is anything that initiates a flashback or reliving of a traumatic experience. And a trigger, it can be anything. It can be experienced through any of our senses, a sight, a smell, a color, a song possibly. Any of these things can be a trigger. Now back to that little part of our limbic system. The hippocampus, again, is responsible for our memories, right? So when a person has an overwhelming trauma response or they have post-traumatic stress disorder and they're triggered, they have a hard time differentiating between what is taking place right now and what took place in the past. And we see this commonly in combat veterans, right? It's a really common example. They may hear fireworks or like something like popcorn and can have an extreme physical response to that because in their minds, the wires get crossed and they're suddenly reliving their memories as if they're happening right now because of that trigger, instead of a memory that was stored away and that's categorized as something that occurred in the past. So what happens if a person has a traumatic experience over and over and over and over again? What if they're experiencing domestic violence or sexual violence or harassment or bullying? Somebody mentioned that one earlier. What if that's occurring every day, even, just a couple times a week? What happens is the limbic system is essentially just taking over the brain. The instinctual brain is doing most of the lifting instead of the rational brain. The part of the brain that's releasing all those hormones, that's taking over. And a person in this state always feels a threat. They're always sensing danger. And this is what's happening when people repeatedly experience trauma. They're, waking up on edge. They may feel like they have no control over their day-to-day experiences. And the effects of trauma are cumulative. It takes longer and longer to come down to a normal state after experiencing a traumatic event. And a person lives in survival responses then, right? Those fight, flight, or freeze responses. They live in a state where they don't feel like themselves and can't remember the things they want to remember and are reliving these situations that they don't want to relive. So what are the implications here for us with all of this information? I think the biggest thing that we as advocates and first responders to sexual violence survivors can do is just to recognize and remember that no one is picking up the phone to call us because they're having a great day, right? No one is calling to inform us that they're not experiencing violence. We don't get those kind of calls. Instead, we're getting calls from folks who don't know where to turn. They're in crisis possibly. We might be the 15th call they've made today, or we might be the only call that they are ever able to make for help. They're, like I said, possibly in the moment of crisis or in the aftermath of trauma. And no matter how long ago that trauma occurred, we can use what we know about trauma to be better advocates. So in the next part of this presentation, we're focusing on that. So now with all of this information about how trauma is affecting survivors, we have to ask, what is trauma-informed care? And trauma-informed care views service provision through a lens of trauma. It involves having a basic understanding of trauma and how trauma impacts survivors, and then designing services to acknowledge the impact of violence and trauma on survivors' lives and give survivors tools to address symptoms and heal from trauma. A trauma-informed approach is sensitive and respectful. It's respectful of the survivor's own choices, and it comes with supportive intent and a conscious effort to avoid re-traumatization. And we're going to unpack all of that a lot more over the next several slides. And what you're going to find from the remainder of this training is that trauma-informed services are not specific types of services, but what makes services trauma-informed are really the set of principles that drive the intent and the impact of those services. And it's all about placing this understanding of trauma and the impact of trauma at the center of our work and at the center of our understanding of survivors. So some of those principles that drive trauma-informed services are having a focus on understanding the whole individual in context of their life experience. So being able to widen our lens and take a step back and remember that there's a whole life of context. There's a whole complex individual in front of us or on the other line with possibly multiple layers of trauma that they're experiencing. So understanding that we are never going to get the full context should really strengthen our ability to empathize, that we can never know the whole story, right? Trauma-informed services are also infused with knowledge about the roles that violence and victimization play in the lives of survivors. So this is where our knowledge as sexual assault advocates about things like the role of power and control and the role of shame in the aftermath of sexual violence, the role of victim blaming, the victim blaming that most survivors do face when they disclose, or the victim blaming that survivors fear they might face if they disclose, and that keeps them silent. We're practicing trauma-informed care when we're coming from a place of true understanding and empathy for all of those factors. And trauma-informed services are designed to minimize the possibilities of re-traumatization and re-victimization. So for example, if we have these understandings of how trauma impacts our brain and our body, we know that a survivor's response to the trauma, whatever that response was, it was a mechanism for survival. Or we can understand that when this survivor is recounting their story, it's perfectly normal and understandable that the story may be difficult to follow for us. It might be coming out non-linearly because of the way that the survivor's brain has tried to store those memory files, but has malfunctioned in that process, right? Trauma-informed services are hospitable and engaging for survivors because they're designed to facilitate recovery and growth and resilience and healing through practices that, continuously send the message that what happened to you was not your fault. Your response that you had, that you are having, it was and it is, it's human and normal. Trauma-informed services send the message that the survivor is believed and resilient, and that a road to healing is possible. And then trauma-informed services also take into account that collaborations with non-traditional and expanded community supports are absolutely necessary. That is to say that, a trauma-informed practice doesn't assume that I or my agency has all the answers and the necessary tools, but knows that survivors need a whole support system. And that requires me and my agency to work well with our allied professionals, right? And on that note of collaboration, trauma-informed services are also based on partnership with the survivor. So, I mean, that's really key. That's huge here. We're going to talk more about that in a moment, but recognizing the power imbalance that can exist between the advocate and the survivor, and then not just recognizing and acknowledging that power imbalance, but also actively working to correct that imbalance and put the power back in the survivor's hands. And trauma-informed practices are also really about engaging the whole survivor. So of course, in moments of crisis, we're not looking at long-term service options necessarily. In a hotline setting, for example, we're addressing, whatever that immediate need is from the crisis caller. But in our longer-term care structures, we have to think about addressing the needs of the body, the mind, and the brain for survivor healing. As you see from this quote here on the screen and from the statistics that we're going to look at on the next slide, the effects of trauma really go beyond the brain and extend to body and mind as well. In this quote from The Body Keeps the Score, which, by the way, is a book I highly recommend for advocates, but the author describes how trauma can result in physical health conditions like fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, other autoimmune diseases, and the effects don't end there. People who have experienced trauma are 4 times more likely to become alcoholic, 4 times more likely to develop sexually transmitted diseases, 4 times more likely to inject drugs, 3 times more likely to use antidepressant medication, be absent from work, or have serious job problems or experience depression, 15 times more likely to commit suicide. So again, it's very apparent that there are real long-term health impacts for people who have experienced trauma. And we don't want this information to act as some sort of doomsday alarm, but rather as information we can use to inform the types of services we offer to survivors to promote their long-term healing, right? Address all of these needs. So some additional tips for responding to individuals who are in crisis. One is to hold your values close. And holding our values close is about making sure that first we know what our values are, and secondly, that our practices, our actual actions, are reflective of those values. We always want to start by believing. When we start by believing, we approach a survivor with questions about how we can help, not why or how did this happen. And when we start from a place of believing, we assure survivors that we are here to support them, to listen, and to settle fears they may be already feeling about self-blame. It's about, remaining calm. For me, the most helpful tool I have to remain calm is to ensure that I am listening, truly listening, without trying to formulate my next response. Which is going to make me a better advocate for that survivor, not only because I'm remaining calm, but also because I am hearing them, right? Which is what all of us want. That's what all of us need when we're in a state of vulnerability. We need to feel seen and heard. And then affirming that there's courage and strength in reaching out for help. There's immense courage in being vulnerable and strength in saying, I can't do this alone. And survivors, not just survivors, all of us need to be reminded of that when we are in positions of reaching out for help, in positions of vulnerability. And then checking our biases is so important. We have to consider our possible biases that we could be bringing into our services. And we all have internal biases. It's only human. And we might think that we do a good job of hiding them, but our biases inevitably will, and they do display themselves in our practices. So what's imperative is that we recognize that as service providers, you know, we have to actively work to challenge our internal biases. And as advocates, it's our job to maintain neutrality and be there to listen and to validate all feelings, you know, to allow space for the nuance and the complexity of a crisis caller situation without judgment or without our preconceived notions about who they are or what their situation is or what it is that they need. Asking open-ended questions is also really important. So open-ended questions are questions that invite more than a yes or no response. They leave opportunity for the other person to share more information if they'd like. And I will say that I think an exception to asking open-ended questions is why questions, questions that start with the word why, because no matter how well-intentioned those may be, why questions are often perceived as accusatory. They sound accusatory. And we're, of course, wanting to mitigate that when we're speaking with an individual who is likely already experiencing self-blame, right? Some additional tips. I know I talked a bit about listening already, but the 80-20 rule to listening is helpful as well. So that's 80% listening and 20% responding. We should be allowing much more space for the survivor to speak than we ourselves are speaking. And then offering choice is part of correcting the power imbalance between advocate and survivor. I mentioned this a while ago, and really creating an opportunity for the survivor to have some control in the aftermath of a situation in which all control was taken from them. And offering choice too is about recognizing that the survivor is the best expert on their situation. They know better than I do what it is that they need, and it's never for me to make that decision for them. Being trauma-informed is also really about being clear about our own capabilities and our limitations. We're not all powerful, and we do a survivor a disservice when we act on the front end as though we can like wave a wand and meet every need. As optimistic as we might be, our attitude should be that we're, you know, determined to do everything in our power, but we are not all powerful, and there are limits to what we can do. And, you know, we're going to have to pull on other resources, right, to find solutions. That's the place where we should be coming from. And then remembering that silence is okay, right? Especially when we're thinking about having a conversation with an individual who is in that state of vulnerability and sharing the experience of trauma. It's more than understandable that it will take some time to get all of that information out. And often we just have to wait on the other line, you know, silently and assure them like, I'm here and you can take as much time as you need, and share as much or as little as you like, you know, and just allowing for that, that silence, that it's okay that we don't have to have an immediate response or solution. We can just allow the survivor time to process and talk through their experience. I mentioned on the last slide the importance of listening to hear, not listening to formulate my next response, right? And utilizing reflective statements really helps us do this too. So being able to listen and not immediately jump back with, okay, here's what we can do, here's our plan. But often simply using reflective statements, which would be paraphrasing back what I've heard, making sure that I first have a good understanding of what the survivor has expressed or what they need. Because when we are upset or we're caught in the midst of a crisis, there's too much internal information to make sense for ourselves what is going on, let alone to be able to clearly articulate what is happening or what we need to someone else. So it can be immensely helpful when an advocate can hold up that metaphorical mirror to a survivor's experience and say, it sounds like X, Y, and Z, or I feel like what I'm hearing from you is X, Y, and Z. Do I have that right? You know? Avoiding why or questions that could be perceived as blame-based, such as you statements. I mentioned this one a moment ago. The alternative to that is using I statements, I messages. And I'd love to do an activity on the next couple of slides to practice some I messages. So an I message is a statement about the feelings of the person speaking. It's generally expressed as a statement beginning with I and is contrasted with you messages, which those tend to be more blame-based and focused on the listener. So an I message is assertive without putting the client on the defensive and takes ownership of your own feelings rather than implying that they're caused by the client. So an example of that would be, I feel worried that you haven't come in for our last few advocacy appointments. I would like to talk to you about what is keeping you away. Is there a way I can help? Instead of, you're really worrying me, what's going on with you? I'm sure you can hear the difference there. So, like I said, I want to do a couple exercises now. I feel like I've been talking for so long. I want to invite some of you into this. I want to hear your thoughts and let us practice some I message statements. So let's use this example first. A woman who has been the victim of sexual abuse calls you on the hotline. She's intoxicated and she tells you it doesn't hurt as much this way. She's obviously in distress. What would you respond to this woman using an I message? And David, yes, you can type your answer there in the question box. Thank you. Anybody willing to participate? I'll give you a moment. It might take a few moments to articulate what an iMessage response would be. Yeah, thank you, Monique. I would like to see if you'd want to speak to me about this numb feeling. I'm concerned about you. I would like you to explain further, please, at your own pace. Yeah. Yeah, you're starting out with your concern, right? I'm concerned. I'd love to hear from you more. I'd love to help you more, right? I want to make sure you are safe right now might be a response. Are you in a safe location at this moment? And if not, is there something I can do? Is there a way I can help you get to somewhere safe? Yeah, those are all great examples. Let's go on to the next one. Oh no, we're getting more examples in, so I'm going to read these too. I understand you don't want to feel hurt. Let's talk about it. Yeah, absolutely. I'd like you to tell me more about the hurt that you're feeling. Definitely, thank you. These are great examples. So let's do another one. A rape victim has not come out of his house since the rape occurred. You have talked to him many times by phone and encouraged him to attend support groups or to see a counselor. It becomes very clear that he's too afraid to do either of those things. Use an I message to express your concern. How could we express our concern to him by using an I message? Would you like me to come speak with you in person and talk out your feelings? Yeah, that's a great idea, Monique. If this individual is having a hard time coming to coming out of their house, you know, coming to support group, coming to counseling, coming to see me, then yeah, I want to make myself available to come to them, meet them where they are. Yeah, and I was wondering if you're doing all right. Is there anything I can do to help? Yeah, as simple as I'm here to help. What can I do? I'm concerned and I'd like to suggest some alternatives where you don't have to leave your house. Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great suggestion. Or I've missed seeing you at support group. Can I come talk to you? Yeah, so many folks have this great idea to go to the survivor directly, offer that as an option to them. Thank you all. Yeah, and I think also what's important here is validating that fear that the survivor is feeling, letting them know that's totally normal, that's valid. I understand that this fear might be holding you back right now, you know, but you've expressed a desire to be in support group and to be in counseling. So yeah, let's talk about ways that we can still make that happen for you. Absolutely. Thank you all. I appreciate your participation in that. Now, moving on, so much of this practice of being trauma-informed is, to me, about empathy. And so many of you expressed that perfectly through all of your suggestions there. In its simplest form, trauma-informed care is about seeking to understand the experience of the survivor. And I really love this acronym of GRACE that can help us remember what being an empathetic listener and communicator is really all about. And this was coined by a Dr. Rashi, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, Rashi Joan Halifax, who's a Buddhist teacher and author of several books. But Dr. Halifax says that having grace in communication is about gathering our attention, which requires us to focus in on the survivor and remove our distractions. So crisis calls, or any calls with a survivor for that matter, are not times for us to be multitasking. And it can require us to ground ourselves. And there are lots of different kinds of grounding exercises, but the kind of grounding that makes sense for me in this context is to move my body in a way that reminds me of the space I am in. So bringing yourself into your body by touching something around you, maybe placing your hands, your palms on your desk in front of you, setting your feet flat on the ground. These are all grounding exercises that can make us more present and ready to give our full attention to the survivor. And the second thing to remember here is to recall your intention, or what we call your motivation, your values. Answer your why. Why is it that you do this work? Why is it that you care about survivor safety and autonomy and healing? What is your motivation and the values you want to bring to your practice? And then attune to yourself and the client. That's about, you know, asking questions one at a time. Multiple questions can easily overwhelm and confuse the other person. So attuning to ourselves and the survivor is about remaining calm and pacing the conversation. And then we want to consider what will serve the client. Ask yourself what information you need to get before you ask a question. And make sure to keep it relevant and offer explanation if it will not be obviously relevant to the client. And ask questions that will help you provide effective services to the client. So what comes to mind for me, a common example of this is like when we, in our services, so many of us have to split our domestic violence and our sexual violence services. So we often have to find out from a survivor where is the distinction there and what they're experiencing, to understand how we should refer them, who's the next advocate that needs to take on this call. But asking the question, is this a domestic violence situation or a sexual violence situation, may appear insensitive or abrupt to the survivor. So just offering a brief explanation of that, letting them know why it is relevant can make a really big difference there. And then the last thing to remember about practicing grace is to engage and enact and then end the interaction. And Dr. Halifax says that engaging and enacting is about collaboration. So think of this as the part of the conversation in which you are co-creating solutions based on your knowledge and resources and the survivor's experience and their needs and their knowledge of their experience, right? And then the second part to this and the final step is to end the interaction, which of course feels obvious, but what Dr. Halifax means by this is to release the interaction, not simply end it, but release it. Give yourself a moment of recognition that that particular crisis call, that interaction is over. We can let it go, we can breathe out, and we have to release it to make ourselves available for whatever is next. As we're nearing the last several slides here, I want to remind you, you fill an important role. Research finds that victims who work with an advocate experience less distress. They're less likely to experience negative outcomes like self-blame and guilt and depression, and they're less reluctant to seek further help. And that is all so immensely important. Those are major positive outcomes for survivors working with an advocate. But we want to remember too that it's not just the factor of working or not working with an advocate that makes such a difference. What makes the difference is how trauma-informed those advocacy services are when they're provided. This quote is from an extensive research project on social reactions to rape victims, and what these researchers found is that victims may be better off receiving no support at all than receiving reactions that they considered to be harmful. If the response to a disclosure such as rape or other forms of sexual violence is negative, this is going to create an additional negative impact on the victim, which can actually sometimes be over and above the traumatic effects of the sexual violence they've experienced. This particular study I've referenced found that negative social reactions have a detrimental impact on the psychological adjustment of sexual assault victims, including things like increased psychological symptomology, increased PTSD, delayed recovery, poorer perceived health overall. And the self-blame that many survivors already feel can be compounded depending on the type of response they receive when they are disclosing the assaults. And that self-blame is particularly destructive. In fact, research demonstrates that the level of emotional distress victims experience is determined in large part by their degree of self-blame. So that self-blame is such a huge part of the long-term effects of sexual trauma. And that is why mitigating that self-blame in our response and starting by believing is just so, so important and just an essential part of what we do. So what does positive support look like? We've talked about all of these things already, but I just want to summarize, right? And these are actually answers that were given from victims in particular research studies. Victims have said themselves that positive support for them is receiving emotional support, being listened to, not being blamed, being encouraged to talk about their victimization, and receiving the full attention of the person that they're speaking to. And then research has found that, in fact, the two specific behaviors that seem to have the most significant positive effect on victim well-being in the aftermath is having someone to talk to and being believed. Victims who are believed and encouraged to talk about their experience, and then who view those responses positively, they have fewer physical and psychological symptoms than survivors who do not receive such reactions or have received, negative reactions. And one study found that sexual violence survivors who received prompt medical or counseling services were much more likely to seek continued medical care, less likely to blame themselves for the assault, experienced fewer symptoms of PTSD, had less difficulty trusting others, were more likely to successfully return to work. And again, as I'm about to end here, I know we've almost reached 11 o'clock. I just want to remind us, this is the difference that can be made with a trauma-informed practice. At the core of these practices, we are letting survivors know that while their traumatic responses are extremely uncomfortable for them, they are absolutely natural and normal. They're expected reactions to trauma. Letting the survivor know that these responses are normal can help relieve some of the distress caused by the symptoms, and then we can offer some tools to address symptoms related to trauma. And survivors become empowered to better understand and manage symptoms, which hopefully results in feeling safer and calmer, and in them continuing to seek help and feel more capable to face additional challenges they may encounter, and ultimately to continue working towards their healing. And so that's the note I want to end on here. But I'm happy to see if we have any questions before we sign off. Anybody have anything they'd like to ask? And David, I'm sorry, I see that you asked a question earlier, and it looks like this was in regards to the example we gave of the rape victim who wasn't wanting to leave their house. They were feeling some fear coming out to seek counseling or go to support group. And you asked, this is the question about going to the person you're helping, or would you meet in a neutral location of their choice? And I would say that that can be really circumstantial, right? It just depends on what the circumstances are. It depends on what your agency policies are. But I would say that also depends on what the survivor prefers and what they're comfortable with. If this is the survivor who is already having a hard time leaving their house for those counseling or support group meetings, then it might mean that they are only willing to meet within their own home. But then, of course, that requires some conversation with your agency about whatever your practices are there, and making sure that you're safe in doing that and within your own agency guidelines. That's a good question. And I would say that, the way to be trauma informed in that scenario is to make sure that we know our own agency protocols around in-home meetings before we offer that as an option. Because we wouldn't want to have to backtrack, right? And be like, oh, I offered you this possibility, and now I have to tell you, actually, that's not an option. So yeah. Yes, absolutely. Jasmine just asked for my email again, so I'm going to type that out. Or actually, it's on the next slide. That's what I'm going to do. There it is, mbatista@tncoalition.org. There's our office phone line. My extension is 324, if you'd like that as well. That's how you can reach me. All right. Well, thank you all so much. I think this has been great. I've really enjoyed this morning. I really enjoyed getting all of your participation and getting to hear your ideas and all of your expertise and knowledge on this topic. So I appreciate you spending this hour with me. Again, feel free to reach out with any questions or additional comments you might have. And I'll look forward to meeting with you all in the next training. Thanks.